Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media, Ampire. Always much appreciated when you tune in. Don't forget, you can read my work on ESPN.com. I have a story up now that was been up for a couple of days, but it's about how the Commanders and their free agency approach and how it impacts what they might do in the draft and where. So, for example, do they want a defensive end? Yes. Will they force one at 29? Heck no. Do they feel they have to get one in the first two rounds? I don't think so. But could they take one there? Of course. So all these things, but why is that? Well, read the story. So it's up on ESPN.com. In a minute, I will be joined by former Washington Redskin tight end Logan Paulsen, now, of course, an analyst for the organization. I had told you this was going to air on Wednesday, but Logan became available on Monday, so I wanted to run this earlier because with a couple days before the draft, I want the podcast with Logan to give it a couple days so people have a lot of chances to listen because Logan is always very smart. So that's why I want to have him on. And so my final podcast before the draft will air on Wednesday. I'm going to give you my final thoughts based on things that I've heard, things that I think, things that you learn throughout the process. And I'm going to also explain my ESPN NFL Nation mock draft pick, which that show will air on Tuesday at 3 o'clock on ESPN. But I want to go into explanation as to why I chose the player I did. I don't dislike the pick. I'm not in love with the pick because I don't know that the whole pick is based on what I think they will do. I don't know that that's what they'll do. I do know there's definite interest in this player. So is he a possibility? Yes. Is it a likely one if it unfolds that way? I don't know because there's other guys that I like that I could see them going in that direction. And I'll get into all that for Wednesday, in addition to some other things that I've heard and just et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that will air on Wednesday. Today it's Logan. And again, ESPN NFL Nation mock draft is at 3 o'clock on Tuesday, 3 o'clock Eastern time on Tuesday on ESPN. And then in my final thoughts, I'm going to also be throwing out a few more names and just again, some guys that maybe you haven't heard a lot. I know one of the guys I'm going to mention, Adam Schefter wrote about him or mentioned him today in an ESPN.com article. It's a name that I dropped for you club members a couple weeks ago on one of the private podcasts. So a club member podcast, I should say. So if you want to become a club member, go to the Empire Media YouTube page, see the word join, click on that, go from there. Anyway, there you go. And I'll get back to you gold members doing another Zooms, to doing more of the private Zooms next week. So anyway, folks, that's it from me. Here's my conversation with former Washington Redskin tight end Logan Paulsen, who also has the Take Command podcast and does a lot of work for the team, which he will get into. Here you go. All right, Logan, well, always good to talk to you and always good to know that we're in the final days leading up to the draft because I don't know how much more people can take of the draft talk, especially when it's at 29. Like, we don't know, right? Last year we knew pretty much. This year, a big mystery, which should add to the intrigue. But I am curious, like you've been doing this for a few years now, and I know when you were a player that you would evaluate tight ends and you kind of keep your hand in that. Now you're doing it deeper dives. What have you learned maybe the most about the scouting process during this time? Maybe an evolution of your scouting process during this time.
Yeah, I think two things. One is there's a difference between scouting and talent evaluation. I think that's the main thing is like when you talk to really good scouts or people that have been in the industry for a long time, I'm talking like director of college scouting level guys that have been doing it for 30 years. I think it's relatively easy to identify good talent. It's the scouting portion that's a little bit more challenging, like understanding, what makes the guy tick. Are they going to be a right fit for your culture? What's their legal background? Do they have any kind of like skeletons in the closet? Talking to their coaches, talking to their high school coaches, like that's where the sweet science of scouting, I think, really, really becomes important. And I think a lot of people just think, oh, it's like this guy's good. Yeah, he's good, but is he going to be out of the league in 6 months because he's going to get arrested or because he doesn't love football or whatever it is? And so I think that's where that to me is the biggest difference between like when I started doing this and then now where I'm at. Is like when you make calls to people, it's not so much about, oh, this guy's good or this guy's bad. It's like, I don't know if this guy loves it or this guy's got this thing. And then all of a sudden you're like, man, the public doesn't really know about this player. And on draft night, everyone goes, why is this guy falling down boards? It's because of the other stuff. And I think the other thing that every year I'm reminded of it, I probably forget about it every single year, but just beauty is in the eye of the beholder,
Right.
100%. Depending on who you're talking to, depending on about what position, depending about what scheme you're trying to fit. Like, so, like everyone's talking about these edge rushers, probably because it's relevant to the Commanders. But when you look at that group specifically, like you could talk, I was talking to someone the other day and they had a guy that is kind of definitively in the top 10 for a lot of people, and they had him rated at 64. And it really just depends on what you're looking for, the traits you value, and your general talent evaluation process. So I think that's always important to remember with this stuff also. So both those things I think are things that I'm constantly being reminded of every time I do this, year on year.
And it's funny because I think it's important to remember too. And I'll try to remind people, and I know others do, but when people talk about, like it's not like every board, like to your point, not every board is set up the same. So when people start talking about, well, that's a reach, well, according to who, you
Yeah.
know? And like that's the
Well,
thing that like you don't know. And like last year, I would hear with the tackles that there wasn't a wide gap between guys drafted in the second round and guys drafted late third or early fourth. And so it was beauty in the eye. And like you have to keep that in mind. And also, if a guy is falling, always ask yourself, why is that? Like,
yeah.
and don't just get wowed by the name and what you perceive as a talent, but ask the other questions as well. And it's
Well,
hard
it's
for the
so
public to know.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, like this is the first year that I've done like a big board. Like for example, it'll be up on the Commanders website. It's like 100 prospects, so make sure you guys go check that out. But like when you're doing it, you're like the difference between player X and player Z is is negligible. But like in a big board, you have to rank them one
Right,
to
right.
1 to 100, and so it looks like, oh my gosh, this guy's at 20 and this other guy's at 40. But that's where like that horizontal board that people talk about, where you rank
Mm.
players across tiers, becomes so important, because then all of a sudden when I'm like taking my big board, my 1 to 100, and putting it in a horizontal, you're like, actually, like this guy, player X, is the same as player Y. Like, and even though there's 10 spots different between them, I think that's the other thing that fans don't understand, because of the subjectivity of the draft. Like, there, that element is often lost on people. It's like, I can't believe this player's still here. It's like, why? They're a tier 3 player. Like, that this is well within the reasonable expectation of outcomes when it came to this specific player. So that's it. Yeah, I think it's just important to remind people that it's an art, not a science.
Right.
And there's so much subjectivity to it, and there's so much flexibility to kind of rankings and things like that. So I mean, shoot, if you want like a fun little task to do, is go look at Daniel Jeremiah's big board, go look at Dane Brugler's big board, go look at PFF's big board, and you'll see there's a wide, even in those 3 publications, which actually aggregate different mock drafts things and put them together. Like, there's wildly different views on players even in those 3 big publications. And so imagine what it looks like for NFL teams.
And it's funny because I'll get a chart every year from somebody who puts together based on talking to teams. And this is somebody, clearly in the business, but not on the media side either. Like, but they get the compilation, and sometimes, and I'll look at how, like, this is how teams view these players,
Yeah.
and the tiers and all that. And sometimes you see it, and then you also see the red mark, which means injury, the purple, which means injury and character designation. So like there's all sorts of things that it may be, and again, it may be different. Like, we did our NFL Nation mock draft, and there's some guys who went higher, and I look at the tiers according to this chart, and it's like this guy's not going to go that, probably not going to go there. But
Right.
again, then you don't know, because one team may like that guy up there, and then the rest of it is irrelevant if that team likes him.
100%. Like, so for example, like Dane Brugler, who works for the Athletic, just came out with the Beast, and I'm doing my big board, and I'm kind of comparing some of his write-ups, because I think that's the other thing is I don't understand why people do this. It's like, I need to trust my evaluation. I need to
Right, right,
trust my perspective. But if you think about how a team does it, it's a dialogue, right? You watch him, I watch him, we talk
right,
about him, and
right,
then we come to some type of consensus on
right.
where he fits. And so, like, it's crazy. Like, reading, Dane's done this for a long time, reading some of the stuff he's written about guys, and I'm like, I totally disagree. And he's a smart guy. I'm a smart guy. Like, even comparing him to what Daniel Jeremiah does, and you're just like, this is why it's so hard to come to consensus on people,
Right.
right? And especially in this year's draft, it's even more challenging, because there's not like these definitive blue chip guys at the top, right? It's like, honestly, between picks like 5 and I want to say like 40, there's not as much difference as I think people want to call attention to. So I could see any kind of amalgamation of players going in the first round, because it's literally going to be like players 5 to 40, there's not that big of a difference. Who do we like out of that group? So you could get a guy like Landon Jackson from Arkansas that goes way higher than people think because they're all in kind of a similar tier. And I think that's why this draft in particular is so fun to talk about, because it is so up in the air, and I really can't wait to see how it all shakes out on draft night.
But it is, I think that's a great point that like when you're doing this, you're doing the solo. When I'm watching, I'm trying to get my take on this particular player, and I'm not doing the same deep dives that you are. But when you're watching it, but when a team is doing it, you are having a group of people doing it. And it's funny, I remember one time, because I used to do like a lot more analysis of after games, whatever, than even I do now. I remember talking to one of the scouting director here, and he said something about it, about something I had. I said, "What did you think?" He goes, "It's just like in here. 5 are going to agree and 5 won't." You know what I mean? And so, like, that's rare that there's unanimity on, because you may have a defensive back coach or somebody who scouts this region pushing for a guy from the Midwest region versus someone from the Southeast, right? And like they may love those guys. So how are you going to differentiate that? And like, how do you come to some sort of agreement on the board? It's a fascinating process, for sure. Like, and I'm intrigued by that, but I do agree. Like, I like to see what other people have written after I've watched a guy,
Yeah.
right? To see like what do I think, and like and then it's sometimes like do I come close to that? But then on the other hand, you don't always have to. There's room for disagreement on guys.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's just a good barometer. It's a good check, good heat check for you. Like there's guys that I really, really like and that people aren't talking about. And I'm like, why aren't people talking about them? So I'll call, guys that I know on different teams. I'll call other draft analysts and like, what am I missing? And they'll be like, well, maybe think of it. He's like, I see what you're seeing. They'll be like, I see what you're seeing, but maybe think about XYZ. And then when you think about XYZ, you're like, actually, like that's a big deal. Like a good example of this is like Mason Taylor, the tight end from LSU. Like I didn't really know what to do with him. Like I felt like he was good in line, but not great. I felt like he caught the ball well, but he wasn't like a difference maker in the pass game. So I called some of my friends and I just was like, what do you do with him? And it's like, the thing that I feel, this is what the other person was saying. The thing that I feel when I watch him is I feel that I can trust him. And I was just like that. And then it totally changed my perspective on the player. All of a sudden he went from a guy that I was a little unsure about to be like, I agree with that. And that trust is extremely important. And now I see Mason Taylor as like a fringe first round pick because of how glowingly and because of how confidently some of these people that I talked about him. And you're just like, okay. And I'm really glad I had that conversation because they didn't bring any new information to me, right? But they reminded me of something that's extremely important when making those selections for NFL teams that for people in the media is not as important, right? It's like that personality, that work ethic, that can I coach this guy? That's not as important. But for a coach, for an organization, it's extremely important. So when they said that, I was like, oh, they love this guy. They love what he brings. And I think Mason Taylor's a really good example for me where I was like, maybe late second, early third, don't really see the athlete. But then when they say that, you're like, he loves football, he's coachable, and I trust him. I was like, people are going to fall in love with him.
And especially when you're handing out big deals, trust is a big factor.
Yeah.
So is there anybody that maybe you would have evaluated differently, maybe in addition to him, but someone else, like maybe because of the more you know, the more well-versed you are in doing this, that you've come to a deeper level of like, or maybe even the other way?
Yeah, I think the one guy that really jumps to the forefront for me is Shamar Stewart and Donovan Ezerako. I'll put them both in the same thing. So
both of whom are possibilities here if they're sitting at 29.
Yeah. So Shamar Stewart for me, like probably even 2 years ago, I'd be like, he's a top 10 pick because of the physical athletic upside. The film's not bad. I think he plays really hard. He's got great physicality. Like his splash plays are tremendous. But the thing that I keep coming back to, and the more that you watch edge rushers, the more you read about edge rusher profile, is the production is extremely important. So I think he's like 22 on my big board. And again, that doesn't mean I hate him, right? Because again, like that third tier of players, which he's in, like the first one goes at 10. So could he still go at 10? Yeah. But for me, because of the lack of production, because of some of the stiffness you see in his play, you're like, I still love this style of player, but I don't think he's going to be a top 10 pick anymore because of areas where I've been burned on in the past by these high-end physical freaks that aren't great football players. And I don't think that's a great way to characterize Shamar Stewart. I think he's a fine football player, but is he ever going to give you that high-end upside that you're looking for with a top 10 pick? I have my doubts, and that's why he moves down the board a little bit. And then you get Donovan Ezeraku, who is kind of almost the opposite. He's a little bit undersized. He's 6'2", he's 243, he's got 34-inch arms, but you just see this tremendous production from him, a guy that understands how to rush the passer. And there are some questions to me about his ability to be a consistent run defender. I think he does a fine job of that, but how's that translate to the NFL level? But he's a little bit higher on my board now because, again, I've been burned by this lack of production, physical freak, and this guy with high pass rush upside. So I've switched them on my board. Donovan Ezeraku is higher, but that's an area where I've matured a little bit. And the other area where I've matured a little bit too, I think, is again with not thinking about what the tape is showing, but also thinking about the character, right? So when you hear something about a character concern, just as an example, James Pierce Jr., like whether it's true or not, it always makes now I'm way more leery of a player like that or Luther Burton III or even Mike Green, like that's going to push guys down my board a little bit because I'm always like, Walter Nolan's another guy where it's not that they're bad kids. It's just there's some like work ethic, maturity, character stuff, which again, for teams that are drafting him, those become big issues. So again, those guys kind of I think they're fine football players. The film's good, but I've been burned in the past by saying, oh, they can work around that. But NFL teams are like, no, we got to get this guy ready to go now, especially if it's a first round pick.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that too. Like because you hear something like, well, they have the culture that can absorb that. I think there's a line to be drawn. Like there's some guys like that maybe they're just a little bit on the fringe and like you can bring them in. If they're too far a certain way, let someone else try and bring it out of them. That's what do you like? Where's that line to be drawn with the guy? And I would put like Green and Pierce in different categories because with Green, teammates and coaches love him, and it
Yeah.
was more about accusations. I don't think all teams look at him, with these major red flags. I think there's some teams that are feel like he's the accusations maybe weren't accurate.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't
No,
know, but I know there's some teams that don't have a problem with him. With Pierce, I would put in a different category because his is more of a football. It's more football related
more
than
football character for
yeah,
sure. And I think I kind of, in the conversations I've had, which, people aren't going to pour their heart and soul out
right,
to me. But again, like it's kind of falls in the same bucket. Like people seem to be more comfortable with Green's
right,
transgressions or alleged transgressions. And the thing that I always come back to too, and this is something that you talk about what's changed for me, the thing that has not changed for me ever since day one is I had a coach tell me one time is if a guy doesn't love football,
right,
like that's basically like, put the black mark of death on that prospect.
right,
And so when you call a team and they say, I don't know if he loves football, like that kid's probably off the board. Like
right.
that's like essentially what it boils down to. And not everybody said that about James Pierce Jr. to me, but I've heard it enough where I'm kind of like, I don't know. And again, like this is where the scouting part of this
Right.
comes in. You have to go meet with the guy. And I think another Dane Brugler turned me on this. I was listening to a podcast he did the other day. It's like if you see a guy going on a lot of 30 visits, teams are trying to understand what kind of player and kind of person that is.
Right.
And that's where this decision about can we integrate this guy into our football culture here becomes so important. Because if you think about it, the team only gets really, the Senior Bowl if they go, the combine, the 30 visit to determine, coupled with their investigation process, to determine whether they can make this fit. And so oftentimes, like if there's a big enough red flag, or even if it's like red, like orange flag, yellow flag, it doesn't need to be a red flag. It's just there are other players that we feel more comfortable with. And when you think about it, the big board that a team has doesn't look like my big board. Like I have to have 100 players on there in order. I have to account for all different schemes. Teams are trying to eliminate guys. They're trying to say, we don't want to draft this guy. And so they just take him off the board and they say, if we're in this position where, we get to 29 and it's James Pierce Jr., Savon Ravel, Benjamin, whoever it is, for the fan, they're like, oh, go with James Pierce Jr. But for the team, he might be off the board completely. And I don't know that, but I'm just giving that as an example, like because teams are trying to eliminate prospects. They're trying to eliminate guys and make this decision as easy as possible when the pick comes up.
Right. And absolutely. And that's where, like I said, you don't want to overstate the culture you have as well. Like,
Yeah.
respect the culture you have and don't think that you can, like coaches and teams, I think and I would say anybody gets in trouble when you think, oh, I remember Joe Gibbs. We used to always say this, like, people, he say like, well, people tell me, Joe, you can turn him around. He goes, guy's been like this for 20 some years. What makes you
Yeah.
think I can turn him around in one? Respect what you can and can't do in these
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing about the draft process, which is so important to remember, is like you can pick who you want to pick, right? So why would I pick somebody who I have questions about? Like it just doesn't make sense to me. Like I can pick, so like like you're picking between player X and player Y, and player X is you're a little uncertain about or you don't love them. Like pick player Y. Like
Right.
that's what this is about. And I think there are a lot of teams that fans sleep on that factor is that these teams have to work with this guy for the next 5 years, hopefully, right? And they need to make sure that he fits like what they want and that the coaches want to coach him and that he's going to get better. Like those things are all so important. So, yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's something that on draft night when you see Mel Kiper and that name is still sitting there, like there is a reason. There is a reason that guy is sitting there. We don't know it and we might never know it, but there is something injury, character, bad interview, whatever it was and that guy's going to stay there. And so move past it. Think about other guys on the list because that guy's probably not going to get drafted to your team.
And sometimes they can be wrong with how they perceive how this guy's future is going to go. If
Yes.
you're playing percentages here, and if you're picking and you're giving a guy a lot of money, then you want to make sure. Now, I will say the funny thing is the NIL stuff gives you a better indication of how guys react to that. But I do think like you are playing percentages here for sure. Is there a position when you look at 29 or anything with these guys? What are some of the positions you say like I really hope they address these areas?
Yeah, I don't know if they need to address anything specifically. I think the thing that I just keep coming back to, and people have asked me this question a ton, is just find the best football player, find the best commander. And so again, that goes back to the scouting process, like we talked about. Again, I do think if I had a preference, I'd say at some point in the draft, I'd like them to find somebody with pass rush upside. That doesn't need to be at 29. That could be in the second round. That could be in the fourth round. There are some very diverse edge rushers in this class that can fit that bill. And so that's one. I think corner is another one just to get more talented. And for example, like if they were to draft an offensive lineman at 29, hypothetically, I don't think they go this direction, but I'm not going to hate that. If that's the guy you've designated as the guy that fits the Commander's culture and is who you want and is going to make this football team better and is the best player on your board, then pull that trigger and make that happen. And so again, I think we've talked about it a lot. Edge rusher, corner, receiver, even to a certain extent, I'm okay with. But the number one tenet at 29 is get more talented wherever that looks like. And even if you select a defensive tackle, I know a lot of fans are going to kind of be wringing their hands and yelling at the TV. Like I want good football players. And if you've designated that guy and you feel like he's the best guy for your team and your organization, let's do that. Let's get more talented. And I think that's ultimately what I come back to when they're picking at 29.
I think it's a simple credo. If you want to build a good roster, you draft good players. You know what I mean? It's seriously.
Yeah.
And Greg Williams used to say this, and Ryan O'Halloran used to cover the team years ago. We would joke about this, but we would ask, and Greg Williams would go like, you know what kind of football players I like? Good football players.
Yeah.
Well, it's a basic philosophy, but it's really true. Like, so that means that you don't reach for a guy, or not reach. Again, there's that word, but like
Yeah.
you don't take a guy because you feel like, oh my God, we've got to get this guy, even though
Yes.
these guys better. That's why, like, even with the edge, I don't think they force that pick if there's not a guy they love because they feel like they did enough in free agency to like, can you live with maybe getting a guy later in the draft? I think the answer is yes, and develop him. Like if Olafadu's there at 61, I think they'd be pretty happy. But to your point, I just don't think there's an area you have to address. If they took an offensive lineman there, the thought of them building a line for the next 5 years is really, really enticing to me.
Yeah. Like I think about Donovan Jackson from Ohio State, and like I watched him last night, and yeah, he ended up being much higher on my board than I thought he would be, but just a good football player, right? He just play guard, play little tackles, got the length, got the athleticism you're looking for. And I think about him playing left guard, a position that he played in college. There's no position switch, and just building that wall in front of Jaden Daniels, and it's an exciting proposition because I look at Patrick Mahomes when he's at his best, he's got a great offensive line. I look at Jalen Hurts, excuse me, and his progression and development as the offensive lines developed. And I I wouldn't hate it. I wouldn't hate it. I know a lot of people are like, oh, we've handled this problem. It's too much to invest in the offensive line. I disagree, right? It's the most valuable asset in football that you're protecting. And when you look at Jaden Daniels, like when he's at his best, he's protected, he's composed, he's got a clean pocket. And if you can find ways to encourage that even more and picking a guy at 29 that is just a good, solid, upstanding citizen, a good, solid football player, like heck yeah, like I get really excited about that. So yeah, and this is one of the reasons I'm such a nerd about this stuff. I can't wait to see what they decide because there's so many good football players. There's so many good players. Like Emeka Mbuka is another guy that I love his tape. He's not the most exciting athlete of all time, but man, is he fun to watch. Or Jaden Higgins from Iowa State or Knoll from Iowa State. Like, what if they went that direction at 29? Like, that'd be awesome. Like, and there's just so many of those guys there. So that's to me in this class. You said, oh, it's tough picking at 29. To me, like that's the most exciting thing for this team because the top of this draft is kind of mid.
That's a good point.
Mediocre. So now you're in this thicket of really dynamic, good football players, blue collar workers, and I'm just like, man, it's like a kid in a candy store. So you can pick whoever you want and just find the best player on your board.
And it's funny you say it because I do agree, and I think they can find a guy who can help. I think the beauty of this draft, Logan, is that you can find a guy in the first 4 rounds who could come in and help you this year, depending on the position, right? But regardless, I think you can find those guys in this draft. And it's funny because, again, sticking on the O-line, like obviously I like Donovan Jackson, saw him play all the time. Egbuka, I think is outstanding. I always felt like, he's just a professional player and has been for a while in terms of his approach and his attitude, et cetera. He'd be a really good guy to have. Another guy I really like as a guard is Booker from Alabama.
Yeah.
And I think he'd be a guy like, again, can you plug and play those guys? The answer is yes. And I think you'd have a line to protect your greatest asset for the next 4 or 5 years if all goes well, And so
I totally agree. And again, like then there's Gray Zabel. He's kind of in that mix too. I think he probably goes a little bit higher, but if he doesn't, he's sitting there for you. Pull the trigger. Josh Connerly from Oregon, I think could play guard. I think Ariante Ursary is that'd be a little bit high for me. But if they picked him, like here's a guy that can play right tackle and bump Coleman into guard, like whatever you're going to do, like there's a lot of solid football players there. And even a guy like you mentioned later in the draft, like Jalen Travis from Iowa State in the 4th round, 5th round as a developmental piece to kind of add depth, I think is a great selection. So Charles Grant from William, and there's a lot of football players here that again, like it's a funny draft. It's a really funny draft. And like when you talk to people, and it's not just me saying this, everyone's saying it, but the top is weird. It's a weird top. I'd say the first 15 picks, it's just like, what are we? Who are you? Who's going to go here? And then you get in this kind of really nice window of just like, these guys are all, maybe none of them are going to be Pro Bowl Hall of Fame guys, but they're all good. And I think that's what's exciting about the end of the first, early through the second, into the 3rd round. Like that's how I feel about it. And you mentioned the 4th. I think there are some really good football players you could find there too. So I think that's something else that I'm excited to see. Does Adam Peters decide to trade back and add some draft capital in that window? Like Fred says all sorts of crazy stuff. Smoot, I'm talking about. But one of the things he said, he's like, I'd rather 2 picks in the 2nd than 1 pick in the 1st. And I agree with that. And I think like that's kind of how I feel about this. So if you could find a dance partner for that, I think that'd be outstanding. But again, that's why I'm so excited because they're in a good spot to get a good football player and, kind of make this football team better. And that's what the draft's about.
Yeah. And I would agree with Fred with that. Like, I think if they could somehow add another pick in rounds 2 through 4 and get yourself 4 picks in those rounds, let's say, which would be by trading back, I think that would be ideal for them. I think for them, I think they'd be excited because again, I think you can find 4 guys who can play. And even if it's a developmental guy at a position that people perceive as a need, like edge rusher, okay, because I think you have the depth there to help those growing pains along. You know what I mean? And same with, a couple other spots, but I don't know. I think that would be ideal.
Yeah, I think it's something we talked about a lot. It's like they've done a really good job. You and I have talked offline about this more. Is they've done a good job of kind of getting ready. You bring in Debo, you bring in Laramie Tunsil, I think you've brought in some really solid defensive free agents, but you need to get younger and you need to get more talented. And so how do you do that with draft picks? And the other thing that I'm excited for Adam Peters is just how they handle the UDFA process. Cause last year they absolutely killed that. They had a couple guys make the team from that group. So it's exciting. I definitely think it'd be awesome if they could add more picks in that second to fourth round range. That'd be fantastic. But if they don't, like, that's the one thing that Adam really impressed upon me last year is like, if you have a vision and clarity on what you're looking for, you're going to find good football players that fit your team and your identity. And then if you handle the free agency process, like that's another spot, or the UDFA process, like that's another spot where you can get really good. But I do think getting younger, getting more talented, I mean, that's the goal of every team, but I think that's got to be a priority in this draft for the Commanders.
And then the last thing is looking at some of those players they took last year. Who are a couple of those guys that maybe like, hey, I think this guy, because Dan Quinn always talks about the year, everybody always talks year 1 to year 2 jump.
Yeah.
Who could make that kind of a jump for you? That big jump?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm really excited about a lot of the guys, a guy that obviously Jerzon, maybe that's cheating, but I think coming off the injury, like having a full off season, like, and seeing how he was playing near the tail end of last year, you know, I just think he's wired the right way. He wants to be good. He can be good physically. He can be good. And then the two offensive skill players that they drafted last year, I'm curious to see how those guys progress. Because Ben Sinnott, I go back and look at his draft profile from last year, and he is one of the freakiest, most explosive athletes at the position last year, and even in this year's class. So if he can kind of figure it out and continue to develop, I think that would be outstanding. And then Luke McCaffrey, like I look at his pedigree, his background, how he works and how he's wired, and I just think he can develop. And I think if you can get something out of those two guys, an improvement, that would be fantastic. But to me, Jerzon's got to be the guy, and then obviously McGee. Because of the injury, like I think he could be special, kind of in a rotational role, getting more reps, learning and getting mentored by Bobby Wagner, I think would be outstanding. So those are probably four guys that I just kind of look at. And again, Jerzon, I think, is kind of poised for something special. I think McGee is kind of poised in that same role. And then with the offensive guys, it's like, can they learn how to become pros and find those opportunities? And I really am curious to see if they can do that.
Last thing, give me some, you got some things you need to plug over the next couple of days leading into the draft?
Yeah. So obviously draft is a big time of year for us over at the Command Center show. So make sure you guys check that out. I think we've got a live stream that starts an hour before the draft. We got a live stream post draft, I think. And then we've got Ticket to the Draft podcast where we'll kind of review the pick. We've got the Command Center pod. And then I've got my 100-player big board, which I think will be up on the website probably Tuesday or Wednesday. I haven't sent it to Selby yet, but hopefully in the next 24 hours. So make sure you guys check that out. So just go to the Commander's website, check all that stuff out. And, there'll be some good football content there.
And the Take Command podcast with Craig.
That's right. With Craig. That's right.
Don't forget Craig. He'll be saying, Logan, what are you doing? You're killing me. So but anyways, Logan, thanks as always, man.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Logan for joining me, and thank you as always for tuning in. I will be back on Wednesday with my final thoughts leading into Thursday draft. And by the way, I will be back after Thursday's first round. I'll do another podcast. I'll be doing one after the Friday's draft, and I'll do another one after Saturday's picks, and probably another one for Monday. So there you go. It's going to be a busy time. So tune in for all that stuff. I always appreciate you tuning in. I'll talk to you next time.